a discussion with documentary filmmaker Dave Greelish about Before Macintosh, the Apple Lisa. This is MacVoices. Today's edition of MacVoices is brought to you by the MacVoices Dispatch, our weekly newsletter. Visit macvoices.com/newsletter today, sign up, and stay up to date. Welcome to MacVoices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, we have a real treat for you today, and for me too, because I get to reconnect with an old friend and someone who is very important to the Apple community, if you will. Dave Greelish is a documentary filmmaker who seems to have a bit of a thing for Apple. Dave, it's good to see you.
Thank you, Chuck. It's good to see you too.
Is that fair to say that you kind of have a thing for Apple?
Yes. Yeah, it's been a big part of my life. Apple computer and the Macintosh especially, and then the Lisa before that.
I have to ask, because you're in a completely different area, so you are not necessarily exactly in the tech field. What is it about Apple that captured your attention and made you want to focus some of your work on the company?
Well, I mean, actually, I am in the tech field, and most of my professional experience, it also came out of the Apple Lisa, and so now we're getting right into the meat of it. But that's kind of like why I ultimately wanted to make this documentary. So my very first Macintosh was an Apple Lisa that ran as a Macintosh. But to kind of more answer your question is, I was in college. It was 1986 or so, and I got a part-time job at a computer store, and they sold Apple, IBM, HP, Compaq, and Epson. And about 90% of everything that went out the door was IBM compatible. That was a term we used back then, right? Before Wintel and so on. But internally, everything was done on a Macintosh. So by this point, late 1986, you had the Mac Plus, the PostScript was in place, the Laser Writer, and AppleTalk, and a hard drive. So you could have a basic network, like desktop publishing system in place. So we did all of our, back then computers were really expensive and you had to do estimates for people and lay it all out in a document and they'd go think about it, especially consumers. And so I was just dealing with consumers, but I was just like, there was all these DOS machines and then this Macintosh. I'm like, there's no question to me. This is the future. This is what I want to own. I'm not buying one of these things over here. So that was it. I made my decision late 1986. This is what I want to own as a computer. And so that started all of that.
I think everyone that is an enthusiast for Apple products probably has that moment that, and some people get it right away like you did. Some people kind of have to be drug along. I know I've brought a few people along and turned them into switchers and faced the exact same things. Oh, that's awfully expensive. I could buy this one over here and it's like a quarter of the price. And it's like, yeah, and you're getting about a quarter of the computer. And that's about how long it's going to last you. And the next thing you know, they've got phones and watches and Apple TVs, and it's like, yeah, this is great. I'm so glad that you drug me into this. And that's next. That's next. Well, so we're here though to talk about your latest project or your newest project, and that is the documentary about your first Mac, the Apple Lisa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, also, if you don't mind, let me make another quick comment that really just occurred to me. What's interesting about people that want to choose a Macintosh nowadays is I almost kind of, it's not an original analogy, but I almost kind of make the analogy of cars. Like, why should I buy a Mercedes or a BMW versus, Kias are nice, or I don't know, say a Mazda or whatever, they're all cars, right? And there's maybe some extra comfort and quality or whatever, but they all do about the same thing. So now it can be about the build quality, about how cool it is, how it looks, impress people with it. There's a lot more of that going on with the Mac nowadays, I think. And there's lots of arguments why you should buy a Mac or not. But you see, what's interesting about back then, it was all about how you used the computer. Like, no one was particularly impressed with the box. It was what you could do with it, So anyway, just to get that out there. So to me, that's kind of an interesting, that's how it's changed. Because now, let's face it, Windows and Mac OS are way more alike than different. So you can pretty much mostly get the same experience, right? Using it.
I might debate you on that one. As far as, but I freely admit that I'm completely biased, and I also have 1 or 2 years of experience, on the Mac OS,
Yeah,
and so as a result, Windows just never feels quite as elegant to me. But
and I
that's
agree. I
a
agree.
personal thing.
And
Yeah.
I'm sitting in front of my Mac, by the way, right here. So I've always had a Mac. So for since 1989, my very first one, which was an Apple Lisa. And so I guess back to your question is was it like, why did I make the documentary? I forgot now.
Yeah, well, yeah. I
Just
mean, yeah. What is it? Just the fact that that was like a first love, and you wanted to relive it?
Yeah, yes, and more than that. So my real quick story on that, you can ask me more questions, is so basically, I worked at an Apple dealer some years later from that first part, 1989. Okay, so it's late 1989. I actually worked for an Apple dealer in Gainesville, Florida, and I have a little intro in the documentary that I tell this story. And so I wanted a Mac more than anything, and then I'm learning how to do desktop publishing for the first time to help sell Macs and to customers and stuff. But even with a discount at an Apple dealer, I had no hope of affording one. Like a basic Mac Plus and a 20 megabyte hard drive, that the Mac Plus would sit on top of, a third party one, not even an Apple one, right? Was maybe like, I think, $1,600 to $1,800. And it might have well been $10,000. But then one day this guy brought, I'm across the store, and this guy's struggling to come in the door with what looks like this really big Mac. And I've never seen it before. And he takes it over to the service guy and drops it off and leaves. And so I head right over to the service guy, and I'm looking at it like, what is this thing? I've never seen this. What is this? And he's, oh, it's a Mac XL, a Macintosh XL. What? Never heard of it. Well, it's an Apple Lisa too. So, and then, back then, you got your news from Mac User and Macworld magazine, which I read every issue every month. And then shortly thereafter, I noticed an ad in the back from a company called Sun Remarketing in Logan, Utah. They were selling new old stock Apple Lisas that were essentially upgraded to be Mac Pluses. And I researched a little bit more, and I could get one for $1,095. And I had one credit card. I was 23 years old, something like that. 24, I don't know, but I don't want to calculate it. So I had just enough on a credit card to buy that and have it shipped, to my house. And so it became my very first Macintosh, because it ran System 6.0.2. So it was a Macintosh. It didn't run the Lisa software. So I was learning Quark Express, and I could run Quark Express on it. And then I learned how to do desktop publishing. And again, make this short, I went into doing desktop publishing. I joined the military, did a lot more of that. Then ultimately I became a computer tech and a Mac tech. And of course, and then from there I bought real Macintoshes. A Mac Classic was my next one, because that's all I could afford. The big problem I had with it, though, was printing, because I would save something on a disk and take it to like computer land or something, or business land, and print it off their laser printer one, and then go duplicate it or whatever if I needed to. So I never could get it to get a compatible printer. So that's why I had to finally upgrade to a Mac.
That's a pretty good reason.
But so that is the genesis of that launched my career. It also launched just my fascination with its history, and that just grew. And the Mac history, Apple's history, personal computer history, and so on. And I just went from there.
And I guess that's the thing I want to get to is, a lot of current Mac purchasers probably look at it and say, as more of a product, and as opposed to, I don't know, I don't want to overstate it, but a cultural icon that I think the Mac has become. And that's sort of why I wanted to get into it, because without overstating it, the Mac is kind of a cultural icon. And yet a lot of people now who are, even the switchers, are just looking at it as a product, maybe a superior product or an alternative product. They don't catch that fascination with the history. But I can understand from what you said, coming from where you did and what you were doing with it at the time, that it kind of it gets under your skin. And then with you thinking as a documentary filmmaker, it would seem an obvious thing to want to tell the Lisa story.
Yeah, and the whole documentary, I'm proud to say I'm a documentary filmmaker now, but that all came very slowly from other things. So, ultimately I just had an idea that, people see old computers. This is the early 90s now, fast forward a little bit. And people see old computers as junk. And it was trash. And it was not uncommon to see an old IBM PC on the street, which now can be worth $1,000 in nice shape or something, which isn't a ton, but it's worth something, But old computers were garbage and trash and useless. And I was like, that's an interesting hobby. Maybe I'll start collecting old computers. And then I had a desktop publishing background, so I started doing a newsletter, and then the internet came about, and so I started a club online to distribute my newsletter, and then made my own web page, and then I started doing podcasting and interviews, and just grew and grew and grew. And one of the threads through all this, though, is I love documentaries. So about anything, and I believe you can turn the TV on and just start watching some documentary. It might not even be something that you care that much about or you think you would, but if it's compelling, you enjoy it because it's interesting. And I'm that person that enjoy that kind of stuff. So I was involved in the Apple Newton documentary, and I think it was 2018, and I just did a little short for it called A Quick History of the Personal Computer, short history, I think. And that kind of gave me the idea of, maybe I could do a whole documentary. And so I did it finally.
So how do you, again, I keep saying as a documentary filmmaker, because that's what we're here about.
Yeah.
But how do you go about even starting the process? We all know, obviously, it's intertwined with the Apple story, but how do you decide where to pick it up, and how do you decide who you want to talk to, and then how do you get them to actually talk to you?
So again, a few things leading up to that helped a lot, and the fact that I'm a self-made computer historian, and that so I'd been studying and researching this stuff forever. So I was already a bit of an Apple historian, an expert on it, especially the Lisa, because I owned one and studied a lot of it. It started all this, but also when I was doing podcasting, I had already interviewed Bob Cook from Sun Remarketing. That's the company I bought my Lisa from, and I'd actually already interviewed John Scully, and that was a huge deal that he accepted my request, and I did that interview. That was 2012, not quite a year after Steve Jobs died, and so and he agreed to do the in-person interview for the documentary, and of course Bob Cook, and I'd reached out to a few other people, but more specifically to your question, I'd also done 2 other Kickstarters. So ultimately, I took those newsletters I made and made them into a book, and I did a Kickstarter for that in 2011. And then I did a Kickstarter for the very first Vintage Computer Festival Southeast. It's in the Atlanta area. I helped organize that. So I had some experience with that. So I did a Kickstarter to raise some initial money to make this documentary, pre-sell some copies. But more specifically, I was involved in an Apple Newton documentary. And so I knew a documentary maker. And so I interviewed him, if you will, unofficially, asked a lot of questions, got a lot of good information, did a lot of research about cameras and lighting and sound, and then I started contacting people and and I made an outline. It's one of the first things, what's the basic story? How's it going to be broken up? Who is it I need to talk to? And there's some people I didn't get to talk to that either I couldn't get a hold of, they turned me down. Lisa Brennan Jobs, for instance, turned me down. Not that her interview would have been that key, but that would have been a cool thing to talk to the namesake of the computer, right? A few other people I couldn't get a hold of, or they weren't available. But then I think I ended up interviewing 14 people, but they're pretty good key people, and I just would schedule it, and and I raised I think about $8,000, something like that, on Kickstarter, and then I probably spent that much, so it cost me out of pocket which is still, it's a pretty cheap budget, 20,000 maybe, 25,000 in the end. But it was just it became my part-time job for a year and a half or so, just the filming part. And I practiced with the camera. I got my lights, my sound system, just a basic microphone and a digital recording, and learned how to sync it, And then the very first interview I did was John Woodall, and he's the guy that runs Vintage Micros, and he's what I call the last Apple dealer. And there's more in the movie, But he accumulated a lot of the Lisas after the fact, and then ultimately Summer Marketing went out of business. He bought all those up, and he's refurbished them and sold them, and he still does. I don't know if he has any Lisas for sale anymore, but he was in South Carolina. I was in the Atlanta area, so I drove up there to like 4.5 hours and interviewed him. And then James and John from the Retro Maccaster in the peninsula of Florida, the Panhandle, I'm sorry, wrong word. And so I drove down there and interviewed them. And then, then I arranged and I flew out to New York City area, Salt Lake City, Silicon Valley twice, and then ultimately West Palm Beach, Florida, where John Scully was. And, my wife, or it's really my ex-wife now, I better be correct, but she gave me some really good advice way back in 2012 when I was talking about maybe I could talk to John Scully for that podcast. And I'm like, why would he talk to me? Some little podcast. She says, well, just ask. All you can do is say no. Just ask. That's kind of the best advice, I think.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I did
agree with you. Yeah, I'm sure I would think that a lot of these guys, especially if you have any kind of credentials or you clearly are interested, that they want to tell the story. They want to.
Yes, exactly.
I'm not quite ready to say set the record straight, but at least they want to give their perspective on the record.
And I would say you were right with the set the record straight. I'm very proud of this documentary, and I did put words in people's mouths. And in fact, I introduced the documentary on camera. I'm talking to you, and I introduce my story and everything, and I end the film, and you just hear me. But you don't hear, except for minor little example, actually, but you don't really see or hear me. That's the style I chose to do to documentary. It's just set up with cuts between the interviewees talking, telling the story. Obviously, I edited it, and that's what you hear. It's like the Lisa. It doesn't get enough credit. It really is kind of the unofficial prototype of the Macintosh, because it wasn't meant to be a prototype Macintosh, but it really kind of served that purpose. So in that sense, it was successful, and it reminds me. It's interesting too. It parallels the Apple Newton story, which was a market failure, but ultimately it was a big success for Apple because of the ARM processor. So even though they poured a lot of money into the Apple Newton and they never recouped it, same thing with the Lisa, ultimately Apple recouped tons of profit from the Apple Newton to this day. If you're sitting on a Macintosh with Apple Silicon in it, trace its roots right back to the Apple Newton. And again, whether one of my little elevator talk things is whether you use Mac OS, you're using Windows, Android, or iOS, you're using that traces right back to the Lisa.
That's a really interesting comment, because as we record this, we are a few weeks past the canceling of the alleged Apple Car project. And there's been so much debate over, gee, Apple wasted all these millions of dollars on this. And I think you make an important point that nothing is ever wasted when you're doing this kind of research. It just can be morphed or folded into other products, and you've learned something. And frankly, you've probably learned a lot, just like they did with the Newton, that we won't even understand that until 8, 10, 15 years from now.
Right. Apple was lucky, or not totally lucky, obviously, but they were fortunate to, they lost a lot of money, before the Macintosh, and even the Macintosh was not successful initially. So the Apple II carried Apple well into the late '80s. It really wasn't until I think '88 or so that Mac sales even equaled Apple II sales, much less surpassed them. So they had the Apple III, big loss, then the Lisa, and then fast forward into the '90s, they're doing pretty good. The Newton's a big loss, but I guess my point is that they were at least fortunate in a position where these losses, they could keep them in house and build on that. That's my point. Build on that failure into success, versus even in other companies and other products, sometimes things fail. The company goes bankrupt, or another company buys them, and then still that research, that technology, somehow it comes into some other products, but by another company. Maybe not that same company, because they fold in most cases. But Apple's been fortunate. So you're absolutely right. They're going to keep that research and all that stuff in-house. Maybe they'll do a car 10 years from now, or they'll do a buggy.
An Apple buggy. No, I hope
the eye can fly.
I almost hope not. No, I really don't want to see that.
A golf cart. I don't know.
A boat, yeah, an Apple boat. That's
flying boat. There's the future of
there
transportation.
There you go. So were there any, I mean, look, you lived through this time period and you lived with that machine. Were there any surprises that came out of the interviews as you went along?
I want to say yes. I'm trying to think, but because I did a lot of research, of course, reading and stuff before, so I kind of knew, or at least was pretty sure I knew a lot of this stuff. What was I know there were some that came out of it. I think the thing that jumps in my mind is I was very pleased with and it sure made for a great closing out the documentary with, because sometimes that's a hard thing to do is you want to have a story that it builds up and tells a story, and then somehow you got to close the story out. Now this is a documentary, so other than just coming to the end, but the end happened a long time ago. But it's like, what's our takeaway from the Apple Lisa, right? And so the film closes out with John Scully, and which is very appropriate. He was a former CEO, president, and Steve Jobs had left with the canceling of the Apple Lisa, but he. I can't remember his exact words, but what he had to say is very nice and very, very relevant. But I don't know. I didn't expect him to say anything bad, really. But I guess what surprised, he had a lot of nice things to say about, sort of along the lines of how it wasn't a failure and how these people worked really hard and what a great team they were, and just what a magnificent technology they came up with, and a lot, even though that product failed, about how a lot of the things that the Lisa team developed, again, it carried right into the Macintosh team, with even some significant people like Bill Atkinson literally moving right into the Macintosh team. But a lot of this technology is transferring, and just a lot of kudos for that work. That should be respected and admired, even though the product failed. Because a lot of people are too simplistic in their thinking that, well, it's a failure. What do I need to know? It failed. It's like, wow, okay.
Yeah, and looking back at the history of Apple, there are a lot of things that you could judge a failure. Like you said, the Newton. I guess it depends on how you define failure. But we would not have the Mac without having had the Lisa, and we wouldn't have had either one of those if we hadn't had the Apple II, et cetera, et cetera. We probably wouldn't have the iPad or the iPhone without the Newton. So
And obviously, it's more complicated than that, and not to try to oversimplify it, because obviously the current Mac comes out of Next, and even iOS came out of Mac OS 10 out of Next Step, right? So, but still, that all traces back to, that was all influence. What's the seed of all that? And obviously, the Lisa wasn't the first graphical user interface computer with a mouse and pull down. Well, it actually was a pull down menus and all that. And a lot of people, they push back with that. But what they don't understand is, Apple did not steal this technology from Xerox. They were inspired by it, but they did a lot of their own work. And everything we take for granted now, it wasn't just lifted from the Xerox Alto or Star. It's in the film. There's a scene where someone at a Vintage Computer Festival, Josh, get people's name right, he's demonstrating, the Xerox Star interface, and you can clearly see. Obviously, it has a mouse. It's a graphical user interface. It's what you see is what you get, but it's not Mac OS. It's not even Lisa OS. And so Apple didn't just lift that and steal it or whatever. If you'll indulge me, it's almost like, to me, there's two words that a lot of people like to assign to Steve Jobs, and then I'm going to follow it up with John Scully, and they're unfair. Like Steve Jobs, genius, jerk. And then John Scully, well, he fired Steve Jobs, and then he ran Apple into the ground. It's like, that's not true. Neither of those, well, genius part of Steve Jobs, okay, maybe. But you see what I'm saying? Like Lisa, just failure. And Apple, they stole it from Xerox. It's like, no, it's not how it all went. It's not how it happened.
No, I agree with you. And we don't want to get into debating history here, but it's worth going back because there's a tendency, I guess it's just human nature as time goes by, to simplify things down to just, one or two words or even a paragraph. And then that sums it all up. And it's so much more interesting than that. And okay, so somebody at Xerox PARC had these ideas. there's no doubt that Apple refined those ideas. They took those as raw material and made them better.
Absolutely. Just the analogy I love best is about automobiles. Even by the 1920s, I don't know, 1930s, let's just go with. The steering wheel was always in the same place, the speedometer, the accelerator, the brake, the clutch. Someone that made a new automobile didn't go, well, we can't be like Ford. We can't be like Chevy. We have to be original. We're stealing their ideas for the user interface. And it's really the same thing. Once things be kind of proven out, this is how it should work. That's why it still exists right now in 2024. We are still using that. Isn't that crazy? From 1984, really 1984, 1983, then with the Lisa. And again, you can go back to 1981 for the Xerox Star, and even earlier with the Alto, and the essence of those things are there. But they're different too in a way.
Probably every industry, especially hard product industries, everybody's standing on everyone else's shoulders that came before them. Because otherwise,
exactly.
And definitely there are times that maybe somebody takes a step to the side or takes a step back and branches off in a little better way. But for the most part, it would be stupid to throw away something that has worked, or at least not to consider how that might be implemented in a new machine going forward. And that feels like what happened between the Lisa and the Mac.